2 years and 50 devlogs later, maybe it's time for a fresh look, don't you think? Hey everyone, HannahMouse1 here. If you're new to the channel, welcome. I'm a Scratch developer who loves helping aspiring creators to make professional quality games, even with beginner-friendly tools. For the past 2 years, I've been documenting the journey of building my farming game A Farmer's Life through a devlog series. And while I'm thrilled to see new viewers joining, I also get that 50 devlogs can be a lot to catch up on. That's why I've condensed the entire series into 3 easy-to-watch supercuts. Today's video, Chapter 1, covers the early days from devlog 1 all the way to devlog 15, ending with the release of the game's first official build. So whether you're a new viewer, looking for a recap, or just here for a bit of nostalgia, and maybe a cringe or two, editing was humbling, this video is for you. Let's dive in. I always start with some basic artwork for my games. I know art shouldn't necessarily be something to focus on at the start of development, but I find working with like generic squares and rectangles really boring, and I'm guessing that this is a bit more visually interesting for all of you as well. I start with tile scrolling. I use a custom block with run without screen refresh selected to load in all the tiles, so it happens all in one frame. I give each tile a value based on its position on the screen and the width of the world. Where possible, I'm using a variable for the number of tiles in the world width and height, because right now I don't know how big I want the world to be, and this makes it easier to change in the long run. I'm using WASD for movement, and I change variables for the X and Y positions in the world. There's a variable also for what tile is in the top left corner, so that the tiles know what costume that they need to take. All the world's tiles are stored in a list, and then the clones can use their values to determine which costume they should show from that list. The reason I have such a big border around the edge of the screen is because tiles can't go fully off the screen, and this hides the jump that they do at each end of the screen and makes it look like it's one fluid movement and not moving and then resetting and moving and resetting. The world generates randomly, with the options of large trees, and small rocks spawning randomly in each tile, and then all the other tiles are grass. If there are any 4x4 patches of grass at the end of this, there's a chance for this patch to become a large rock. So then I wanted to add some natural systems in. Like first I give the small trees the ability to grow into big trees after a certain amount of time has passed. For this, I create another list to house additional information about each tile. In this, it stores a time for it to change. When this time passes, the tile switches from type A to type B, causing the tile to update costume. I also make it so that seeds can drop if there's a tall tree next to a grass tile, and after a while that grows from a small tree to a big tree. Eventually, because of this system, any non-rock tile in this world would become a large tree. Everything is set a lot faster than I want it to be, but for the sake of example, this works pretty well. I add in a daylight cycle, but all this does right now is change the brightness of each tile. It probably will have some effect on whether or not plants grow in some capacity, but for now, this is enough. I start to incorporate the player into the game. I start by making the player sprites so that the player can appear to face up, down, left, or right. I set it up so that the player faces the appropriate direction in relation to the direction of movement. I also separate objects such as trees and rocks from the base tiles, making them into 2 separate sprites. This will just make things easier down the road with props and all that stuff. So that way, like when you water them, for instance, I don't have to make a different sprite for every single one. I can just affect the base tile and not necessarily the plant itself. I stop the player passing into tiles with something to collide with in it, so like trees or rocks. I make it so that the player can't move through those. And I add in the walking animation based on the timer variable. Then I make it so that tiles and objects highlight if they are within a certain radius of the player character and the mouse is touching it. The hardest part of this was trying to get it so that the tile, like the base tile, isn't selected if the mouse is touching the sprite over it, because I'm pretty sure that the is touching mouse pointer block is more about the X position of the mouse pointer, not like it can't be blocked by another object over it, so you have to like take that into account and like make it so that if it's touching the other object it doesn't highlight that one and stuff like that. But I did get it figured out. For now I just set it up so that objects get destroyed when clicked. Obviously in the future I will have different effects when objects get clicked, but for now. The hardest part of this was getting
the entirety of a large rock which covers 4 tiles to get destroyed regardless of which of the 4 tiles the player clicks. I start to add the ability to select different tools to till the dirt and water said dirt using a watering can. I start by creating the tools, an axe, pickaxe, hoe, watering can, and I create the hotbar from which each of these tools can be selected. I have it so that you will always have these as your inventory. You will always have the option of these 4 things on your hotbar at all times. I also spent some time at this point just revamping and cleaning up some of my previous scripts. I just made everything cleaner and more efficient. Then I went back to the tools and started giving them some functionality. So the axe is able to cut down trees and the pickaxe can cut down rocks. I made it so that you could till the grass and turn it into soil using the hoe, and then you could water the soil with the watering can. I gave the watering can a max water with a visible water meter that appears whenever the watering can is selected, and then it runs down as you use the watering can. This is the first element that made the game actually feel like a game. For now, the can just refills when you press R, but I will add a river that runs at the bottom of the farm that you'll be able to refill the can from, and eventually you'll be able to upgrade your watering can to increase capacity. I then made it so that elements like trees or rocks have health, and now you have to work them down to destroy them. Again, you'll eventually be able to upgrade your tools to destroy these objects faster. At this point, I just threw in some polish elements like screen shake or basic sound effects when objects are hit to make it feel more effective. I also add in the river that runs at the bottom of the farm that you can refill your watering can from, which just involves making some like water sprites, and a sprite for the edge of the water, and just adding in 2 rows at the bottom which are just water. I make animations for using a tool in each direction. For now, this is just the axe being used in each direction. It serves its purpose for the time being. Down the line I might make versions of this for the pickaxe and the hoe, but for now. Each of these animations comes in 2 phases, pulling back and swinging down. I use the pre-existing state machine code to add these in, and I also create an animation for using the watering can. Then I create a health bar for the items like the trees and the rocks, and it's visible at the top of the screen. It helps to create a sense of progress as you hack away at the objects with higher health levels. Some games do this by making cracks appear in the texture, take Minecraft or Terraria for example, but I didn't feel like making 20,000 costumes for trees at varying levels of degradation, so the health bar will have to do. I also go through and add in a couple sound effects. It helps make everything feel punchier and more effective. I do one for the water refilling and one for pouring, as well as a sound for tilling the soil. For now, all of these are sound effects taken from the Scratch sound effect library. Down the line, I might add in my own sound effects if I want the sounds to be a bit more appropriate and polished, but for now, these are just standard sounds, and it's shocking how much of a difference sound effects make to the feel of your game, so it is definitely something which is worth getting done. I set up an inventory system. I start by making buttons that let you switch from play mode to inventory mode and back again. I set this up in a way that will allow me to quickly and easily make new tabs when I set up shops and the like. I make juicy little mouse over effects because you'll be using these buttons a lot. They may as well be satisfying. First, I make it so that the buttons just change a tab variable, and then I make all the necessary clones and sprites disappear when I go to the inventory and appear again when I go back. I also created some inventory pages for the various items, resources, seeds or plants. Next is the items themselves. For now I only need wood, stone and acorns, but there will of course be dozens of items in the final game. These 3 are all resources, so I set it up so that they appear on the correct tab. I also create a bunch of labels that appear when you mouse over stuff. I make it so that the icons are faded out when you have none of an item. Finally, I create an indicator for how many of an item you have, preemptively allowing this to go up through the thousands and the millions and so on. I'm going to spend some time completely redoing all of the code, making it much better optimized and easier to expand upon going forwards. First, the tile scrolling. I used a really complex way of doing this before, requiring the project to constantly do a lot of math, lagging the game. I also take this opportunity to create a nice fence that runs around the edge of the field, creating a proper perimeter. Another alteration that I make is to try and get collisions a bit more precise. Before, it was just colliding with the entire tile if there was something in the way. But the basic grass costume is split into 16 smaller squares, so I think if we get it to the individual square, that'll be close enough. I go through and give each square a value of 0 if it's empty and 1 if it's occupied in 16-digit strings. If you're in an occupied square, you get reverted to your previous position. Then I make it so you can walk right to the edge of the screen when you're too far across for the camera to pan further. You can now interact with anything on the screen regardless of how far it is from the player. This being limited wasn't really adding anything, and if anything it was making the game less fun, so I just ditched that. And trees no longer spread like they did before, and you'll just be able to plant them. This just makes it easier to keep your farm neat. I work on item drops and placements. I start by creating a pickup animation for each item. The animation itself is just a basic fade up and fade down over the player's head, with the sprite rising and falling accordingly. I make it play for the appropriate item whenever the player breaks trees and rocks and the like. I also make it so that the items in the inventory increase appropriately when you pick them up. I then set it up so that acorns can be placed. I try to make this as modular as possible, so adding new items to this should be easy enough. I make it so you click on an item in the inventory, and if it can be placed, it takes you back to the farm, except instead of a toolbar, you have information about the item. Certain items can only be placed on certain tiles. For instance, acorns can only be placed on grass, and each time one is placed, one is used up from your inventory. You can return to the inventory by hitting the back button, and I create a whole bunch of sprites for the various items. I start with wheat seeds. Eventually I got something that I was really happy with, and then I use this as a basis for all the other seed sprites. I make seeds for cauliflower, corn, pumpkin and tomatoes. I create all of their vegetable forms, as well as vegetables for potatoes, carrots and parsnips. Instead of seeds, you'll be able to buy these vegetables themselves and plant those. And I set up the entire inventory so they all have their own place on the correct tab. So all the seeds appear on the seeds tab, and so on. I want to eventually have several places to go around town, so I opt for a map. I'll make a grid of 3x4 tiles that I'll eventually fill out all of them, but for now there's just the farm and the shop. And note that these icons may change, I'm not super happy with them, and I make them pop up when touching the mouse. I then make it so that the farm button takes you back to the farm, and the shop button takes you to a blank screen that will soon become the shop. But first I want to get the money sorted. I create an icon for the coin and a variable that will represent the money. I can reuse a lot of the code from the item numbers to display this, and then I make a shopkeeper. She isn't going to do much, but I think it just adds a little personality to the shop. I create a buy and sell tab and then stock each of them out with what they have. I make it so that when you mouse over something, it displays the item name, how many you already have in your inventory, and the price. I make it so that you can increase and decrease the amount of each item depending on the tab and have it go to your inventory, stopping it from going below 0 and making it so that it changes your money. I also make sure that you can't buy anything if your money is too low. I make it so that you have 100 coins when you start the game. I'll be focusing on the crops. First, it was a whole lot of art. I needed multiple sprites for every single vegetable that's in the game. For most, it's a seed stage, a growing stage, and a harvestable stage. The sizes are a bit disproportionate to each other, but I still think it comes out pretty cute. And once that's done, I add all of the seeds into the placeable items list, and then make it so you can place these seeds on either tilled or watered soil. Luckily, I already had most of the systems in place, so doing this was pretty quick. Although, at first, they act like acorns and grow into trees, which of course isn't what we want. So I set it up so that they grow into the correct crops. I try and keep all of this as modular as possible to make it easier moving forwards. I then make it so that crops only grow if the soil is watered. Then I add the mechanics in to harvest a fully grown crop. You can use either the axe or the pickaxe to harvest a crop. I then set it so each crop gives a different yield depending on its type. For example, a pumpkin plant might give you 1 pumpkin, but a tomato plant might give you 5 tomatoes. I then sort out destroying the plants. One of the most frustrating things in Stardew Valley is when you misclick and destroy a crop that you didn't mean to. So I'm going to make it so it always takes 2 hits to destroy a crop. And I'll keep it this way if and when I add in tool upgrades. And to make sure that you never end up soft locking by destroying all of your crops before they grow, I make it so that destroying the plant gives you the seed back. So I throw together a basic title screen. I'll probably spice this up at some point, but because I'm just working on a minimum viable product at this point, I think this will do for now. I played through the game for a while and fixed any bugs that I stumbled across. For example, the health bars on the large rocks weren't working properly. I then messed around with the prices of things in the shop to drag out the sense of progression. So at first, only the things you could afford to buy are acorns and wheat seeds, and then other things become accessible to you as you start to make money. And I increased the prices of the produce accordingly, with the crops with a single crop yield being more expensive than the crops that give you 5 or 6 per harvest. I also mess around with how long each crop takes to grow to add a bit of variety to the farming system. I then work on the water mechanics, making it so that the watered soil gradually dries out. This makes the watering a constant thing to manage rather than a one-time situation. When buying items, it's intuitive for items to highlight if you could afford them, and when you sell, they should highlight if you have the item in your inventory. I also wanted it to be so you can click and hold to buy or sell large quantities, because individually clicking when your items get into the hundreds is a royal pain. The longer you hold, the faster you buy. Then I add in a whole lot of sound effects to punctuate certain actions and create a certain atmosphere. On sounds like the purchasing, I make it quieter as you do it so it doesn't give you a headache from the constant dinging of the cell sound. And then there's music. I decided that I wanted to make this myself, but I have almost no experience with composing music. I literally googled most common chord progression, took the result, and used it to create something that doesn't sound completely awful. Eventually I'll make different songs for all the different locations, but for now there's just one that plays everywhere. I'll be creating a new location, the research lab. It starts with some artwork. I create a scientist character decked out in safety equipment, goggles, mask, lab coat, all of that, and I create an icon for the lab on the map. I also create the quotes that the NPC will say. They're all safety oriented, so putting on safety equipment and stuff like that. It just helps to give him a bit of personality to keep the quotes on a consistent theme. Then I create the icon for the first upgrade, water retention. I recently made it so soil dries out once watered, but once you've got your whole farm on the go, it's a bit annoying to deal with. So I'm adding upgrades that will make the soil stay watered for longer. I add in the functionality for that. You can upgrade this mechanic 5 times before it maxes out. The second upgrade wasn't so easy. I add in the option to unlock fruit trees. Much like in Stardew Valley, these will grow and then keep producing fruit as you harvest them. First, it was a lot of artwork. I needed to create items for the saplings and the fruit, as well as 3 growth stages and a harvest stage for each type. There were 5: apple, orange, pear, peach, and plum, and they each have a colour to identify them with. I make it so that these saplings can be bought from the shop and fruit be sold from the shop once you have the upgrade. I then make it so saplings can be placed on the grass. For growing, I just modify the crop script to accommodate the extra stage, and that wasn't too difficult to do. And the harvesting was basically the same as the crops as well, except the plant reverts back to stage 3 instead of disappearing altogether. And then there's destroying the trees and getting that to work at all the different stages, making sure the health was correct across all stages when it grew up without having to individually go through each item. And of course, these will give you wood when they're destroyed. I make it so you can water plants by clicking the plant instead of only the soil tile, and I changed the click to sell line in the shop to say click and hold to sell multiple, as this is a more accurate description of what you're doing. I create the art for a bunch of craft stations: a furnace, a pickle jar, a boiler, and a keg. The furnace is really about getting ready for when I add mining. I actually have to add a couple more inventory tabs for workspaces and goods so that I have a place to put all of these that fit, and I create all of the inventory icons so that they lay out correctly, which involved creating every craftable item, although I only make palette swaps for the most part instead of unique sprites for each one. Like, I didn't create a different sprite for every type of pickle, I just changed the colour slightly. I then make workspaces placeable, sort out destroying them, which you do with a pickaxe, and then I create a place where you can purchase the workspaces from the construction shop. This is basically the same as the main shop, except you can't sell anything here. I also have it display a description of the workspace when you hover over them, because it's not as self-explanatory as the items in the main shop are. I create a new tool, Select, to allow you to click on a workspace and open it. For each workspace, I make it so that all the craftable items display. Of course, for the furnace, there's only one right now, bread, but I'll add more once I add mining. I add something to show how much of an ingredient you have versus what you need. I make it so that the item can be set off into creating, making the sprite grow larger and smaller as it does. But now that the crafting itself is all working, I want to add some surrounding infrastructure structure to blend it into the game. So I create an upgrade to the research lab that allows you to speed up the time it takes to craft, and I also expand the shop so that you can sell the goods that you make. This required adding pages to the shop for all of the items to fit. I'll be adding mining. I start by creating an icon for the quarry, which is where you'll be doing the mining, and putting that on the map. I then create a blank stone mass that will act as the base of the quarry, and I can now populate this with things that you can interact with. I create a border for the quarry made out of rocks so it doesn't look like the camera cuts off randomly. It acts a lot like the fence does in the farm area. I then get all of the rocks generating, creating a random pattern of rocks, big rocks and ore deposits. I make sure that all of the collision, health bars and destruction of these works as it would in the farm itself. I also have to create items for the ores and all of the respective bars. Then I want to get the quarry to refill whenever the player isn't there. I start with the basics, getting it to fill with rocks, and then I get wilder from there, getting the big rocks to spawn in, getting the ore deposits to spawn in. And once that's in place, I add in some research options relating to the quarry just to tie this feature into the existing game loop. The first allows rarer ores to spawn in the quarry, so at first only copper can spawn, and then when you upgrade it can go to iron and then to gold. The second is to make the quarry regenerate faster. Then I make it so you can smelt the bars in the furnace. It takes 5 ore to smelt into a bar. I also create a new location, the Blacksmiths. Here you can buy or sell the bars as well as upgrade your tools. Of course, any new location means all the UI, the character, the button, the quotes, the map icon, everything I have to create from scratch to do this. One annoying thing with this one was that unlike with the construction, which had a very similar colour palette to other areas, the inventory icons just didn't work with the grey colour palette of the blacksmiths, so I had to recreate all the items that you can buy here. Then I create the page to upgrade your tools from copper to iron to gold. This is fairly similar to the upgrades in the research lab, so it wasn't too difficult to implement. I get it to show you how much of the needed resource you have, so you don't have to check in the inventory each time. I get the basic upgrade system to work, and at first it only changes the icons in the hotbar, and then I have to add in the functionality that actually makes the upgrades worth it. Start with the watering can just because that's by far the easiest. All I had to do was, as you do the upgrade, it has to change one variable from the other ones, and actually had to go in and put in variables where I hadn't put in variables before. But I just have to go through each and every instance of the tool being used and set the appropriate damage. I add some goals for the player to aim towards. I start by adding a logbook that documents the player's progress through the game. It lists the crops that you've harvested and the goods that you've produced and the achievements you've unlocked. Achievements, by the way, something else I'll be adding later in the video. Until you unlock something, it's represented by a blacked out version of it with the name replaced with 3 question marks. My hope is that the players will click onto the tab out of curiosity, and the myriad of things to find will encourage them to stick around. To get this actually functioning, I create a list that documents all of the things that the player has discovered, starting with the crops, and I get the icon in the log to update when you've discovered something to actually display the item. I then get the discovered list to update when you harvest a crop. I then repeat the process for the goods. I decided to create a completion bar in the log to give an idea of how much you've got left to do. Another thing I want to give the player to do is to fill requests from the community. I fill a map icon for the request board and give some art for the requests themselves. These are comprised of a sheet of lined paper and the name and headshot of whoever requested it. I then set about generating the requests. With the very little interaction that the player has with the NPCs, I wanted to create small subtle ways to give them a bit of character. So I have the different characters be more likely to request certain items, and if they do request something they want, they're more likely to ask for a larger quantity of it. Besser likes fruit and jam, Derek likes crops, Andy likes booze, and Mia likes things from the quarry. Because the requests will refresh periodically, I want to make it possible to pin them, allowing the players to select a request and spend some time working towards it if they want. You pin or unpin requests if you click on them, as long as you don't have the resources to actually fill the request. The text along the bottom will tell you what function clicking on the request will have. I then code in some of the UI that tells you how much of the requested resource you have, the amount of a resource that they are asking for, and the gold that you'll be rewarded for filling the request. I make the requests refresh every so often if the player is not currently looking at the board and the request isn't pinned. Also, I make it so that they can request more of an item as you progress through the game. I coded the functionality to let you complete requests. This has to remove the item from your inventory, give you the monetary reward, and cause the request itself to disappear. I then create a background for the bulletin bulletin board. It's the outline of the board with a hint of sky peeking through at the top. I then go on to add in achievements. Right now there are achievements for harvesting every crop, producing every good, upgrading every tool, filling requests, and spending money. And there are different levels of each. Harvesting 1 of every crop lets you get the bronze achievement, harvesting 10 gets you silver, and 100 gets you gold. Like the crops and goods, the achievements show their name, but they also show a brief description of what the achievement was for. I get the achievements to factor into your completion percentage, so you have to get all the achievements if you want that bar to fill up all the way. I then go through and make it check to see if you've unlocked the achievements at various points, such as when you harvest a crop or upgrade your tools. This involved creating a record of how much money you've spent, and I had to find every place where you can spend money in the game. I also create a pop-up that will let you know when you've unlocked an achievement. Whenever you unlock an achievement, that achievement is temporarily added to a list. The notification sprite then sees that the list is no longer empty and reacts accordingly, deleting the list item and showing the animation. I spent some time just going through, finding instances of repeated chunks of code and using custom blocks to reduce the amount of times the same thing is written out. It will also help to add in new items down the line, because instead of recoding it for every instance of whatever it is and adding, I can just stick some values into the custom block and the framework is already there. But once that's done, I created a settings tab starting with the icon. I start with the volume slider. I just make it so that it sets a variable I can later use to multiply on any sounds that are being played, and the little speaker icon changes slightly to reflect the volume. I then create some other settings options that I've quite honestly been dreading implementing for a while: saving and key binding. I decided to start with key binding, partly because it's the easiest one to do and partly because it's something that should probably be saved, so doing this before programming the save function is probably a good idea. I start by creating icons for every keyboard input. I create an icon for every button that your keyboard can register, which took some figuring out because not all of the recognized inputs show on the when button press drop down, so I basically had to test all the buttons independently. But I get that all working and make sure that anytime these keys are referenced in the script, it now takes them from the keybind list rather than calling it directly. So now if you'd rather play with arrow keys instead of W, A, S and D, you can. And then I make a small tweak to the Blacksmiths store that I've been wanting to make for a while. Now you can sell wood and rocks there, so there's some reason to actually collect them, or at least a way to use the excess resource you get from clearing the farm and quarry. Then of course it's time to tackle the save system. Scratch doesn't have the ability for internal saves, so I had to do the old school approach and generate a save code. I start by creating a list of every list and variable in the game that needs to be saved, and I then make it so all of these are set within the save load function at the start of the new game instead of randomly in various sprites that they loosely relate to. Mostly more complex scripts like the tile generation or generating the bulletin board requests will stay in their own sprites because moving them would be a pain, and it's easy enough to keep track of anyway, but everything else I move over to the save load sprite. I then make it so that all of these variables and lists can be cycled through and saved into a single very long code. This code is then added to a list, allowing for copy pasting. Then I go through and make it so that the game can ask for the code and then make it back into the variables and lists that created it. To make testing a bit easier, I added the load button to the start screen. I also create a save graphic because saving can take a while and I don't want people to think that their game has frozen while that's happening. And I make the copy code list appear when the code is done saving. I also make it so that you can't click off the save screen because interrupting the save would cause a whole bunch of issues that I just don't want to worry about. And I also create a loading bar for much the same reason. I don't want people to think that their game is frozen while the game is loading. I spend some time trying to balance the prices and monetary rewards for things to make a decent sense of progression. And of course, any play sessions like this are good chances for finding and correcting glitches, making tweaks, and just creating a more streamlined gameplay experience. I then decided to revamp the title screen because I kind of lazily slapped it together for the demo, but it really wasn't up to scratch anymore. I make a whole lot of art for it and create a subtle parallax effect when you move the mouse. I had a few clouds passing in the background to really bring things to life. I absolutely love a bit of interactivity on a title screen, so I make the letters on the title light up if you mouse over them, and I also include the NPCs just hanging out and they react if you click on them, which I think is super cute. And I redo the play load buttons to fit a bit better with the new style. I think the title screen looks so much better and more alive now. Root vegetables only showed up under the plants tab, but it makes sense for them to appear under both plants and seeds to keep the momentum moving when you're planting your crops. I then decided to tackle the sound effects. To make my life easier, I decided I wanted a nice clean slate with this, so I
went through and removed any pre-existing sound effects. I make it so that you can adjust the volume of the backing track with the volume slider, and then I went through the game and added sounds wherever they were needed. I also decided to label the tabs down the side and the locations on the map to reduce how much the player has to wonder what they're supposed to click at any given time. And I create a new research option, the ability to increase the yield of fruit trees. This is because making alcohol at the keg requires 50 fruit a pop, and because of the limited farming space, this can take a really long time to work towards. I also decided that it'd be nice to give a bigger yield for the fruit but increase the time it takes to grow, because it felt a bit like you were constantly having to run back to the trees rather than it being an occasional thing that I wanted it to be. And I improved the thumbnail to better reflect the new title screen for the game. I created a version of the player to include in this. I think that this thumbnail is a massive improvement over what it was before. Then I go through and update the instructions to make sure that the new features are covered and to make it a little bit more readable, because this was another slap together feature I made for the demo. And after that I decide that the game is ready and hit that elusive share button.